But why don't you tell us a little bit about the MMT story for those that aren't fully involved
Hold
in
on.
it? What?
I totally obviously want to go there, but before we go there, if you don't mind, Rodrigo,
Yeah.
I'd love to pause for a second because you sort of said what got you interested in this in the first place was the practical aspect of how this might inform how you approach markets and investments, right? And
Yeah.
so, that's your primary objective in gaining a better understanding about this and all your writing, et cetera. And you're not even that fundamentally interested in policy. And I want to definitely talk about policy, even though that's not really your primary focus. But since your focus is on the banking system and by extension, capital markets, I think it's worth stopping for a second and sort of getting your sense of what is happening right now. I mean, it seems to me like we're undergoing maybe a fundamental shift in policy and how that's affecting the banking system. And so I think it makes sense for maybe you to opine a little bit on the underlying mechanics of maybe what we're observing here.
What is going on right now? I have no idea. Like, really, honestly, like I always tell people, like, as much as I've studied all this stuff and as much as I think I know about this, like, I think the range of potential outcomes in the next like 6 to 12 months are so wide, especially today, like with the news of Putin, like all this stuff, everything that's going on right now, like it all seems to be changing so fast. And the COVID response was so big and so strange that I have no idea what's going to happen in the next like 5 years. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if we had 15% inflation in 12 months. I wouldn't be shocked if we had deflation because the all these bubbles just kind of like, lose their air. So, at a really basic level, like what's going on, I mean, from a very high level, like I think that to me, like one of the big lessons coming out of the financial crisis was that I tend to think that the people dramatically overstate how powerful central banks are. And it's not to say that central banks aren't really powerful, but I tend to think that a lot of what the central bank does is really responsive to things that have already happened in the economy. So for instance, like with quantitative easing, like people often call quantitative easing money printing, but when you look at the order of operations and you think of it from the Fed's balance sheet perspective, like, yeah, the Fed expands their balance sheet, but what they really do is they take a bond that was already printed into existence and they change the composition of the private sector's holdings with it. And they take that bond out of the private sector in essence. And so the real balance sheet expansion occurred when the Treasury expanded their balance sheet running the deficit. So I mean, if you think of it from the perspective of like, say the Treasury, instead of funding their spending through a bond, say they literally printed like a deposit into somebody's bank account when they ran a deficit. If they did that, there would be nothing for the Fed to do after the fact. There would be no quantitative easing for the Fed to implement. It wouldn't change anything for the Fed. There would be no bond to buy. There would be, they would literally be, if they did something like this, they'd be swapping a like deposit for a like deposit, basically. So, things like that are interesting because I think we've, especially in mainstream econ, we've positioned the central bank as this uber powerful entity that I think coming out of the financial crisis, we all kind of learned, well, the Fed, printed a ton of money coming out of the financial crisis, and we still had a really weak recovery. If you look at Europe, Europe ran quantitative easing at the same time. They didn't have the same size deficits, and their economy was abysmal for, the whole entirety of the next 10 years, basically. And so, you can have these huge programs that people think are highly stimulative. And again, I'm not saying that they're not stimulative at all, but I think that they're not the big bazooka that people often think they are. And the really interesting thing about COVID and the response from a policy level was that you got all the same stuff essentially from the Fed, but the big difference was that the government spent, especially in the United States, the US Treasury and Congress, they spent a shitload of money. And so there was this huge balance sheet expansion from the Treasury side that was matched by the central bank side. But I think the big lesson, and we're seeing that now, 7.5% inflation. The big bazooka is when the government spends in deficit. And to me, that was the big lesson of comparing these two experiences and being able to really, compare and contrast them. And so so much of what's going on right now is this weird environment where, I think it's perfectly reasonable to argue that, yeah, there's this huge distortion going on because the government spent, $3 trillion in deficit multiple years in a row. And we're only just getting to the point where it's kind of looking like a lot of that is being trimmed back.